Let me just mention, and I'll wrap it up and let you ask some questions. JonBenet Ramsey and O.J. Simpson. I had been away with my family, the Christmas holiday, and came back. And I remembered when I was away, and while I am an avid reader of 5 newspapers when I'm here, when I'm away, I get away from that. I see an occasional paper and so on. And I remembered seeing a picture of this girl that I thought something like she was a midget or something. And when I got back, there was a phone call from one of the national tabloids. I think it was the National Enquirer or Globe, one of the two, and asked me if I would review some pictures they had. And I said, sure. It happens with me all the time. So they sent me these pictures, and I see it's this little girl, JonBenet Ramsey. She's not a midget, she's a 6-year-old girl. She had been made to look like a woman with all of the, more makeup probably than any single woman here in this audience has tonight, and so on. This little beauty queen, and she's been murdered, they say. So what's the story with JonBenet? Her mother tells us that she got up at 5:30, day after Christmas, and prepare some little breakfast. Family was going to leave to upstate Michigan for the rest of their Christmas holiday, and she sees a note propped up on a step like this. And the note, as she reads it, is a kidnap note. It says, "We represent a small foreign faction, and we're demanding." Well, how much would you demand? I don't think you've done any kidnappings. This is your first one. And this guy, he's worth about $300 million. He just sold his business. So what would you ask? Maybe $250,000? Okay, all right. There's a guy back there in that red sweater. He's done a couple jobs. What, $500,000? $500,000, right? Okay. I see a guy there in the back with a tie and a white shirt. He's trying to pretend he's a solid citizen. I can recognize a veteran kidnapper when I see one. What do you go for, $1 million, sir? What do you think? Okay. So you know what was asked for in this ransom note? $118,000. It's a nice round number, right? Exactly the amount of money that John Ramsey had been paid as a bonus from his company the year before. How many people would have known John Ramsey's bonus of $118,000? And now this kidnapper, who has found a way to come into the house without awakening anybody, knowing where her room is, not awakening her that she would cry out, the brother Burke, 3 years older, just a few feet away, not awakening him or the parents, and he knows about a back set of stairs that go down into the basement that a maid who had worked there for 6 months never knew existed. That the detectives who were called at 6 o'clock in the morning searching for a little girl in a house. That's a good-sized house. Some of you live in bigger houses. They're searching in a house for a little girl. They never found this room at the base of the steps. It wasn't until 7 hours later that John Ramsey says to his then best friend, who turned on him and became his worst enemy, a nightmare for him. John Ramsey says to his friend, whom he invited over, let's go down to the basement and look again. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And according to his then best friend, before the lights are even on in the room, as Ramsey opens up the door, he exclaims, "Oh my God, there's my daughter." And they take the little girl's body up. And the coroner is called. 7 hours later, gets there, doesn't see the body until 8:30. By that time, the indicia that we use, rigor mortis, body stiffening, lever mortis, the settling, gravitational settling of blood and the dependent parts of the body, algor mortis, body temperature, that we use to determine when somebody died. Forget about it. After 8 hours, you know, the error rate, the range is too great to be of any specificity. And so they blew that completely. And it makes a determination that she died, and it's interesting when you read the autopsy report, talks about this fracture on the top of the head of 8.5 inches from front to back, and then the rope around the neck, and so on. Interestingly, the rope around the neck, the collar of this sweater pajama was pulled up like this, so the rope wasn't touching the skin. And down here on the sleeve, where it was tied, it was over the sweater so that it did not touch the skin. And guess what? In the autopsy of this 6-year-old girl, most of the hymen was missing. There was chronic inflammation seen in the vaginal mucosa, the lining of the vaginal vault microscopically. And that means something 48, 72 hours or more had caused it to become inflamed. And then at the 7 o'clock position, focal superficial erosion. And I don't mean to be crude or insensitive, but in order for you to understand this, the women can think of the pelvic exam when a right-handed examiner, or he/she, was examining you and doing an examination of the organs and so on, where that finger would go, 7 o'clock position. And then under polarized light, you take a blue prism and you put it on the optic of the regular microscope, and you see birefringent materials, which can't be seen unless you use the blue prism. You know what the most ubiquitous source of birefringent materials is in every single one of our homes without exception? Talcum powder. You get the idea? There's no evidence at all of penile intrusion into the vaginal vault. There's no sperm. There's no great injury, a minor abrasion. You've got the chronic inflammation. You've got the absence of the hymen to a great extent. You've got the focal superficial erosion at the 7 o'clock position, and you've got birefringent material. Begin to get a picture? I have to spell it out for you anymore. This is a game that had been played many times, who knows, before. Cyril Ramsey, the wife, she was out of the sex business, ovarian cancer, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation therapy. She's not in the business. Little JonBenet, she's the surrogate. There was no intent to harm her. This was a game that was played. The binding phenomenon, not that little girl got any pleasure from it, but the vicarious thrill, a well-known phenomenon in sex games, that binding. In fact, I just saw the TV program. We don't watch much TV. I'm reminded, but I heard about this great program with Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson called True Detectives. I don't know if you've seen it. It's really delightful, very fascinating. And there's this one scene where he, cheating on his wife, Harrelson, she handcuffs him to the bedpost, and then they go on from there. So binding is a well-known phenomenon. But back to JonBenet and our kidnapper, who gets into the house and who leaves the house and who takes the time, by the way, the pen and pencil, pen and paper with which he wrote, and upon that which he wrote, was there in the middle of the night. He went around and found a pen and paper. And by the way, he didn't like the first beginning. He took the notes. He knew that one day it would become a hot item. He crumpled it and threw it to the ground. And then he started all over again, like an English paper, right? And then proceeded to write, "We represent a small foreign faction." And by the way, too, the rope that was used to bind her was conveniently found there. And then he, after writing the note in the middle of the night, he leaves. But what did he forget? How's about the body of the girl that you just kidnapped? You took all this time. You had the incredible chutzpah to break into this house. You knew where to find this girl. You took your time in finding everything to kill her, and you decided that after you had that pleasurable, perverted sexual activity, you would also make it a profitable evening and get some money. Well, how's about picking up a 45-pound body and throwing it into the woods or down a sewer, and maybe you get a chance to get some money? This guy, with all of that incredible courage and patience, does all of that and then walks out of the house, leaving the body. You like that? How do you like that story? So if there's anybody here who believes there was an intruder. The next time you all invite me to Bethel Park and I have my own hair, not a wig, and it comes down to my shoulders, that's when they will have found the intruder who killed JonBenet Ramsey.
I did not understand who you felt was the guilty party in the JonBenet case, and why was there not any prosecution?
Oh, by the way, it's an excellent question. Do you know that about 6 weeks ago, after all these years, that a reporter out there got hold of, it never been disclosed in all those years, got hold of the grand jury's recommendation. The grand jury had recommended that indictments should be brought against both John and Patsy Ramsey. And the district attorney, Alex Hunter, just ignored it. How often do you think that's done? As to who, well, I'm sorry if I didn't make it clear. It's the father playing, the sex game. No intent to harm the girl. I'm not talking about, what we may think of that, and understandably and rightly so. But in terms of, no intent to harm. But I forgot to tell you, I didn't forget, I didn't want to, you know how many murders there had been in Boulder County that year? 1. The year before, 1. They had no experience. Alex Hunter, and I'm not the most prosecutorially biased forensic pathologist by any means. I do a lot of work while I do all the cases for 4 coroners and DAs and testify for them in my private consultations. Obviously, most are going to come from defense attorneys. So I'm not prosecutorially biased, but I do believe that you're going to be a district attorney, then you got to proceed and you got to pursue and prosecute where you should. You know what Alex Hunter's record as district attorney was in plea bargaining in cases that never went to trial? 98.5%. He was he had no more business being a prosecutor attorney than I have being a ballet dancer, and that's what happened. No, it was John Ramsey. And see, what happens is when you tie something around somebody's neck, unpredictably, there may be pressure applied for whatever reason, person twists or turns or whatever, so on, pressure. You have the vagus nerve. There are 12 cranial nerves that emanate from the brain. And the 10th one is called the vagus, right and left. It comes on from inside the neck and enters into the chest cavity and sends fibers to the heart and lungs. As you're sitting here, were you thinking about, gee, I got to tell my lungs to breathe, I got to tell my heart to beat? The brain did it for you. When the brain, when the vagus nerve specifically is irritated, then it may lead to a slowing of the heart, bradycardia, and that bradycardia can lead to cardiac arrhythmia, and the next thing you know, you've got cardiorespiratory arrest. And this is what happened, I'm sure. I forgot to tell you, I did mention the fracture of the skull. What do you think if somebody came up and whacked any one of us on the head and produced a fracture, the top of the skull? And let me tell you before you answer that the part of the brain that keeps us alive is located back here. It's the vital centers, where the respiratory and cardiac centers. So when you have an injury up here, you don't die right away. You die when the brain swells. The brain has no room to go. One of my sons is a neurosurgeon. What they do in these cases many times is they'll actually saw a piece of bone away. They remove a part of the calvarium to let the brain expand. It's necessary. And they'll deal with repairing it later, because the brain is in a closed cranial vault. And when it swells, then the brain is like a thick liquid. And it goes like a liquid does to its only opening. What's the only opening in the skull? Back here where the spinal cord emerges, the foramen magnum, the large opening at the base. And what happens is when the brain swells and the pressures go down, it pushes those vital centers down into that opening and you die. Okay? So now you got this fracture and you got a person who's breathing, and so on, and bleeding, right? And the heart is beating and so on. You know how much blood was found in JonBenet Ramsey's head from that 8.5-inch fracture? 7 cc's, which is a teaspoon and a half. What do you think if any one of us got cracked on the head like that? Do you think there might be more than a teaspoon and a half of blood? She was already dead. That blow was inflicted to make it appear that she had been assaulted by this brutal killer. She was already dead from the rope around the neck that produced cardiac arrest.